and we have to also be building the world that we want.
Yeah. Right.
As we go. We can't just wait for that day to somehow magically happen.
Right.
But we're building it as we go. And that's what abolitionists are inviting us into, is that imagination of a world where, you know, everybody is actually safe.
So I want to sort of switch gears a little bit, although I know it's all interrelated, but I want to talk about your work with the defund the police movement, because it's such a scary thing. And it's not just a scary thing for white people. It's like we've been under empiric standards where we've had the presence of police in whatever form that is for, you know, almost eternity. There are definitely cultures that in societies that existed that didn't have that, but and I do think I'll stick this in there. It's so important to learn history as well, so we understand what's possible. But so tell me how you got to this work in particular. So you call it's defund the police, but it's more than that, because that's also a spectrum as well, correct?
Yeah, that's also a spectrum. Yeah, I mean, I wasn't always an abolitionist. You know, as I said earlier, there were lots of things that I didn't understand. You know, I continue to grow, I continue to learn, I continue to ask, why are things the way they are?
Right.
And how do we make them better? And I really trace my like understanding of myself as an abolitionist to an action I participated in 2007 in Denver when I was in seminary. We were asked to participate in an action being led by Indigenous people in Denver to protest the Columbus Day Parade.
Yeah.
That might sound like, to some people, like, why is that a big deal? But Columbus Day began as a federal holiday, or as a holiday, or the observance began in Colorado. And particularly in Denver and also in Pueblo, Colorado, the parades were like these really gross representations of colonization.
Yeah.
I mean, the figure of Columbus is a figure of colonization, but the parades were also like reenactments of the violence of colonization on the streets of Denver, sitting on Indigenous land that had never actually been ceded to the United States.
Yeah.
It's still protected by treaty, but was stolen to build Denver and environs. And that year, 2007, was 100th anniversary. And so the Indigenous leadership in Denver held an action to actually stop the parade, just to stop it from moving, not actually attack it or anything, but, you know, stand in the street or sit in the street and keep it from moving forward.
Yeah.
And we were asked at seminary to participate in that, to be in solidarity with that. And so a group of us did that. And we practiced all of our nonviolent techniques. We had our plans, all of that. Everyone who was, not just our group, but everyone else who was intending to do that, you know, was very grounded in like nonviolent practice. I assumed, I'll just name it for myself, that our commitment to nonviolence meant that the police would also commit to be nonviolent. Like they would come and they would, you know, they would escort us away, but they wouldn't like actively try to hurt us. Yeah. Especially those of us who were wearing like visible like stoles and collars.
Right.
That's not what happened. Our group was seated right up against the police. Actually blocked the parade first. They blocked the street, and then we all just sat or took the street after they did that. We were right up against the police line. We were sitting in a circle, arms, locked at our elbows, and we were singing Amazing Grace, and started to see like these heavily armed riot cops wading into the crowd, beating people with their batons. Some of the folks were disabled, they were elderly, there were children present. They were hauling people up, they were putting people in pain compliance holds. I watched them harm my friends in our circle as they pulled us apart. Not even really giving us an opportunity to say, I'll go with you, because that was our plan, actually, was not to make them like have to drag us off, but to say, once they approached us, to be like, okay, I'll come with you. But we didn't even get that opportunity. And so, sorry, I'm just having a little moment of remembering that. I'd never seen anything like that before. I probably really naive to expect that we would be treated otherwise, but we were hauled off. I sustained like injuries to my shoulders and my arms and my wrists that I still deal with today because of how I was treated by the police that day. We were held in jail like as long as they could possibly keep us there, even though we had posted bond as a form of punishing us. And when I was going to say when I came out of that experience, but I'm not sure I've ever actually come out of that experience. I'm still like mining that experience for what it means to be a white person on this continent. And the kind of violence that white supremacy will enact to maintain its control. Because I wanted to know what in the hell, like, why did this happen? Why were we treated like this? And when we were in our debriefing sessions and planning for our trials, we heard over and over again from the Indigenous folks and the Black folks who participated and the Chicano folks who participated, like, this is what happens to us all the time. This is what happened to our ancestors all the time. This is how it is. Like, this is what policing will do to protect the interests of white supremacy. And I was like, I did not know that. I thought that we were like, we do our part to be nonviolent, they do their part to be nonviolent, and actually that's not what they're interested in. We tried to like pursue, like some kind of accountability for the harm that they did to us, because it violated their own policy manuals, but nobody was ever held accountable for that. And so again, like, it's coming back to that same question, like, why is this like this?
Yeah.
And so, like I said earlier about sanctuary and about immigration, I began to explore on my own. I began to listen to other people and people of color in new ways, and like my own body telling me, like, we cannot live in a world like this.
Yeah.
Like, we just can't. And the more that I understood about the roots of policing in this country, because policing as it exists in the United States has not existed like this in other places.
Right.
Empires have their enforcement bodies, that's definitely true, but there's, Rome had its enforcement body, Babylon had its enforcement bodies. And so there are ways that we can read our sacred texts and see elements of things that are like policing, like Jesus being arrested and being beaten up, right, before he's executed by Rome. But also policing as it exists in the United States is a new phenomenon. It's a modern phenomenon. And it exists, its roots are in enforcing enslavement, enforcing the genocide of Indigenous people, and enforcing borders and the expansion of borders for like the white colonial and imperial project, Manifest Destiny, essentially. And once I began to really understand that not only are those the roots, but those are actually still the way that policing functions, and white people are being sold a lie, really? That, oh, they're here to protect and serve us and they're here to keep us safe. They're not actually. They're here to control and protect white wealth and power. And as long as we as white people are obedient to white wealth and power, then yeah, they'll keep us safe. But the moment that we're not, they will come after us too. Like this system of white supremacy and racial capitalism does not care about us, any of us. The pandemic, how the pandemic has been handled, should make that really clear, even for like middle class and upper middle class white folk. Like, capitalism doesn't care. Go to work sick, infect your neighbor.
Right.
Like, is that the gospel?
Right.
That's not the gospel.
Right.
That's not the world that I want to live in. Like, it does not care about us. And policing exists to enforce that in this country, on this continent. It exists to enforce that power. And once I got that, then I was like, oh, I guess I'm an abolitionist now, because I don't want to live in a world like that. And I don't believe, and the abolitionists that I dream with, I'll say, like, don't believe that system can just be reformed. Like, we can just make it nicer somehow, because that's not why it exists.
Right.
It's not that there are some bad people who are doing the wrong things. And this kind of goes back again to what we were saying, right? About, goodness is not really actually the measure that we want to look at. Like, what are the actual actions? What is the purpose? It's not a reformable institution. That doesn't mean that there's not good people in it trying to do something different. But there is so much like literal money invested in protecting what policing is, that those few good people, they're not going to be able to change that from the inside.
Right.
And so, what we need are, like what Miriam Kaba describes, is like 1 million experiments to figure out ways to not have to rely on the police, to reduce the harm of police, to practice new ways of being in community with each other that can address conflict and harm, because they do happen. Training ourselves in how to protect one another, not with guns necessarily, but there are ways, like we saw with the synagogue up in Colleyville. Like, they were trained by the FBI, but there are actually like non-policing organizations that can do this kind of training of how to protect yourself in that kind of situation, how to protect your people. And they rescued themselves. Right. So we need all of those. It's defund the police, but it's really about, what kind of a world do we want to live in? What kind of a world do we want to invest in? What is getting in the way of living in that world?
Right.
And if we continue to invest in policing in the United States, that's going to prevent us from getting to the world that we want.
Right.
And it's going to prevent us from getting the world that God wants for us.
The last time we talked, you told me that story about that experience you had in Denver on that fateful Columbus Day. And I don't know why, but I could just hear today, I could hear all the emotion come back. Like I could watch you relive it. And so thank you for sharing that vulnerability.
Thank you for receiving it.
Yeah. Thank you for making something something good out of a very traumatic experience. That people live like you said, people live every day.
People live every day.
And I would say too, for me, it goes back to us being accountable to ourselves, to dream of a world, to think of a world that doesn't have, that where we're not dependent on the police solving all of our problems for us. I'm in no way comparing this to your experience at all, but I had a neighbor who, rightfully so, he's a little scared of me because I almost ran over him backing out of my driveway one day while he was walking his dog because I was in a hurry, and apologized for it because I didn't see him. But we have constables that patrol our neighborhood, and
oh, interesting.
Yeah, and he went and talked to her, the female constable, and who I knew. She and I've had a lot of conversation, and she knocked on my door one day, and I was like, well, this is odd. Usually get house calls. And she profusely apologized, and she said, but he asked me to say something, and so I have to say it. And so for me, that is just like a microcosm of...
that's such a great example, right? Of like, my example is like this huge traumatic thing, but there's also like the daily examples of like, why do you need a constable to talk to your neighbor?
When we've already talked about it and I've apologized, and now I pay attention to where I'm backing out, right? Like,
yeah, like what is that? Like, that is something that white supremacy culture does to us as white people. Like we have to always be pulling the threat of, I'm going to have you arrested. I'm going to call the cops on you. Like, right. Why? Like, that was not, y'all talked about it. Like, and we have a neighbor who lives on this side of us. I'm waving to my left for those who can't see. And he's kind of a jerk. And in the summer, he sits on his porch and plays his music really loud. And we've tried to talk to him. Doesn't work very well because he's homophobic, and we are not. But other neighbors have called the police on him for the music.
Yeah.
And we're like, we're not going to do that.
Right.
We're just going to keep talking to him.
Right.
But it's that, but the impulse, we know that they've come. We've seen them come because somebody else has called them. It doesn't help. It just makes him mad.
Right.
So we just talked to him like, do we know that it helps you to play this music? Because, he's got some mental health stuff. He's a disabled vet. Like, yeah, we actually don't want the cops messing with him because of the mental health stuff. Like, he doesn't need to go to jail. Like, right. We just keep talking to him.
Right. And
gradually over the 3 years that we've lived in this house, he's actually like come around a little bit and won't play it so loud or for a shorter amount of time. Like, it's those impulses, like, that the meme says, the cop in our heads. Like, we have to, part of what we have to do is defund the cop in our heads, like divest from that voice in us that wants to threaten our neighbor instead of love our neighbor. And that is not always easy. We do not always have good answers to that. Right. And we don't have all that we need, because to have other ways of engaging with folks when we actually are unsafe, right? Because there are times when we're like, as two women living here, like there are things that we're not going to engage with. But gosh, I wish that we had a team of, I don't know, big burly people who could go interact with somebody, so that we don't have to.
Right.
All kinds of a million experiments.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I love it. Well, and so again, I'm back to two questions in my head that I'm deciding to ask. But first question, and then we'll talk about talk about this, then we'll talk about Micah 6:8, because I do want to go there. But so how do you talk people off the ledge? Because when that that tendency of people to just freak out when you even whisper defund the police, or even suggest that there may be because it's become so politicized and outrageous and controversial. So, when you're in conversation with someone, and if you're even considering doing more research on what the spectrum of the movement of defund the police is, which I would encourage everybody listening to do, and what that would mean for you and your community. But, you know, before you freak out, like how take a breath and what are some things you would encourage people to think about?
That's such a great question. And you know, I'm sure that there are folks who even hearing my story, you know, just now are having a reaction, you know, because we do, you know, and there is something about there. I mean, just in general, working with white folks on anti-racist stuff is hard work. You know, it requires such a consciousness shift for us as white people to orient ourselves away from the power that we are told that we have, which we don't really have, and orient ourselves towards a multiracial, multi-class liberation movement. I mean, that's such a shift for us just in general. And in my experience of working with folks on our campaign, the Community Safety for All campaign, there's something about policing that taps into something really deep in white people that is really hard for us to wrap our heads around. You know, I talked about my own journey like it happened overnight, but it took actually several years, and you know, and still I'm learning. Still I'm learning. And so I think, you know, when I work with white folks on this, I just try to encourage us to know that reaction is normal, and to honor it, actually, and that it's okay if you're not where other people are yet, and that you have lots of questions, because we all do.
Yeah.
You know, I thought that day in Denver that, you know, the police would treat us just fine, because that's what, like, there was some kind of agreement about that.
Right.
And I was very incorrect.
Yeah.
And then afterwards, did you think that maybe it was just a one-off?
No, because I was listening to the Indigenous folks and the Black folks and the Chicano folks talk about, like, this happens to us all the time.
Yeah. Okay.
And then I began to pay attention to, like, how it was actually happening all the time.
Right.
And then, you know, I think also with social media becoming, like, more aware of, like, all over, it's happening all the time. You know, Trayvon, Tamir, just in Denver, you know, Paul Castaway, Jesse Hernandez, Michael Marshall, like, just Sandra Bland, like, so, like, it's happening all the time.
Right.
And, like, it's hard to turn away from that once you begin to see it, at least for me.
Yeah.
But I think that there is a grief that happens in white people as we begin to realize that we have not been told the truth about how things are, and that is so difficult.
Yeah.
So much has been invested in us to get us to believe that the world is shaped in a particular way for white people, and it's so hard to have that ground, like, broken up under your feet.
Yeah.
And so, you know, if you're having that reaction, just explore it and honor it, and do some learning and ask questions. Like, I'm always telling folks when I'm working with them, you know, I mean, this is where I am. You don't have to be here. Ask me questions.
Right.
Ask me questions.
Right.
And there's actually a ton of work done on the roots of policing, you know, the history, the how those roots tie into the current impacts, like abolition visions, like, you know, I keep an ongoing list. It's 20 pages now. I can send you the link to it. I do that for SURJ Faith. And there's always more to learn. I'm always learning more. I think that another thing that I try to help white folks to be aware of in this is that what we've been told and how, you know, abolition or defunding or however you want to call it gets presented to us in kind of the popular imagination as if it's a one-off event, as if it's a light switch that you can just throw on or off. We may have talked about this before, you know, like today, we have police and tomorrow there's anarchy and chaos.
Right. It's the purge. Yes. Yeah, that's what I always picture.
And that's scary. Like nobody wants that.
Yeah.
But that's not actually what abolition is.
Right.
So going back to Miriam Talbot, it's a million experiments. It's about how we talk to our neighbor. It's about building, you know, mutual aid networks to make sure that people are fed and tended to, you know, in general and in times of disaster and in other times. It's practicing new forms of accountability that don't rely on punishment and surveillance and control.
Right.
It's undoing our theological systems that think that what God wants for us is punishment and surveillance and control.
Right.
You know, it's all kinds of things.
Yeah.
It's getting weapons out of cops' hands. I mean, it's sometimes, you know, it's literally like that, but it's also all of these other things.
Right.
The whole spectrum of things that actually lots of communities have already been practicing for generations because they've had to.
Right.
Not only communities of color, but disabled, like white disabled folks, you know, poor and working class white people who know that they can't trust the police to help them.
Right.
And so they figure out other ways. There's a homeless community in Oakland that they wrote a book together about how they did this, like 20 years of dealing with conflict and the kind of stuff that just happens in human community without ever having to call the police.
Wow.
You know, so it's things that communities are already doing.
Yeah.
You know, ancestral indigenous practices that can not only, I don't mean only like indigenous practices from indigenous people on this continent, but the people that our ancestry as white people, where we come from,
Yeah.
our own ancestral practices, you know, around accountability, around relationship to land, like all of these other things that, you know, prior to when we became assimilated into whiteness, like what can we also recover from our traditions?
Makes me think of the 10 Commandments where, you know, the first 4 are about God and the last 6 are about our relationships between each other. And if we actually followed those, there wouldn't be a need for much policing, if any at all. See, I'm still hedging. I'm like, like I can't, my brain can't quite go there.
We say in the toolkit, like the Community Safety for All toolkit, like, you know, are we asking you to from this day forward never to call the police again? Like, we're actually not asking congregations to do that. We're asking you to explore ways to release that reliance as much as possible. But we also know that we don't live in a world yet where we have the infrastructure that we need. You know, for example, you know, when we still lived in Denver, I think the year before that we moved, our house was broken into. We weren't home. My partner came home and the back gate had been wrenched open. The back door was wide open. Like, you're gonna, you know, she did what she believed she needed to do. And I agreed with her, even though both of us, you know, hold this commitment to not rely on policing as much as possible. But
Right.
She needed to know that the house was safe to go into.
Right.
And so, you know, she called the police and they came, and the officer and the detective were really kind to her. By the time I got home, they had left, but she was also afraid because she's a woman of color, and that summer there were cases of women of color calling the police for assistance and being killed at their homes. So she was also scared, but like, what are you going to do?
What's the alternative? There isn't one. Yeah.
You know, and so, you know, one of the examples that we have in the toolkit of a security plan is a urban congregation that, you know, has figured out, like, what are we able to handle on our own, actually? What can we get trained to handle on our own? And at what point will we call 911 for help? And they've got it all lined out in this document. And like, yes, that's actually really great. That's a really great example.
Yeah.
Because it's not a light switch.
Right.
And do I hope that eventually one day we can live in a world where without policing at all? Yeah, I do. And also, like, this is the world we are in now.
Yeah.
And and we'll do the best we can.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And we have to also be building the world that we want.
Yeah. Right.
As we go. We can't just wait for that day to somehow magically happen.
Right.
But we're building it as we go. And that's what abolitionists are inviting us into, is that imagination of a world where everybody is actually safe. Like, we're handling conflict and harm in ways that don't cause more violence.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of world I want to live in.
So tell me how this connects, and maybe we nerd out for a minute on this, Bible nerd out on this, but tell me how this connects to Micah 6:8, and I'll just go ahead and read that. He has told you, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God. That's the New Revised Standard Version. So how does the work that you're doing, both in anti-racist work and in abolitionist work, how do those connect in your mind with essentially was one of the great commissions, right? Not just the one in Matthew 28, but this one to me is like how we should really be living.
And part of what I want to say about that text is the first part, which you've been told what's good. Mm. Micah is this prophetic text. It lays out like all the prophets do, this vision for how the divine actually longs for us to live together. Mm-hmm. And it's good. Yeah. Like in the creation story, God calls it good over and over again. It was good. It was good. God created humans and they were good. Yeah. And the Sabbath was good and the light is good. It's good. God has told you, humans, what is good. Mm. And so that little trinity then of imperatives is like the how. Mm. How do we get to the good? How do we hold on to the good? Not about good like I am a good person, but the goodness that can be in loving, accountable, compassionate community together. And in our work in SURJ, we talk a lot, as a staff about like how we hold our work with both care and rigor. And so being really clear about what we believe in and why, and holding that position while also having so much love for the people that we're working with and for ourselves, because it's not like we have it all figured out either, And so I see that in this, in this text of like, do justice and love kindness. So again, coming back to like, we're calling people into a vision of the world as the divine longs for us to be. Yeah. And that is a just world. That is a world. Here's some nerdiness on the word justice. The Mishpat. Mm-hmm. Like the Hebrew word is this expansive, imaginative word that's not just justice, like the way that we think about it in the West, in the United States, of like carceral systems, or even like I'm going to do my justice work, but it's about how the society is structured together so that everyone thrives. Like that's actually justice. Yep. So we're doing our part to build that world, and we're doing it rooted in love. Yeah. And we're doing it like rooted in God. Yeah. And in humility. Yeah. Because we don't know, like we're doing the best we can in this moment. Yeah. And we're opening ourselves up to possibility and imagination. and relinquishing some control that we've been taught we've had to hold on to in order to survive in racial capitalism. And that requires humility, that requires open-heartedness, that requires, like, I don't know all the answers.
Yeah.
It requires collectivity, because this is a command. This is an imperative to community, not only individuals, but a community. You know, figuring out how to live together in ways that are not going to replicate the empires that have done them so much harm. And that's our call. Figure out how to live together in ways that don't replicate the harm of the systems that we're living under.
I love that you brought up the word mishpat, because I've been doing a ton of reading on Hesed. It's my word for at least this year, but they are very closely related. Like the Hesed, the loving kindness, the character of God, who is gracious and compassionate and slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, and all the way back to what God calls himself in Exodus. But the expression of that is mishpat. Mm-hmm. And that's where God's desire is thriving. Is not survival. It is for the world to flourish.
And a thriving community means everybody's fed, everybody has shelter, everybody has love. There's nobody in jail. Like, all of these visions of that thriving include, like, we're letting the prisoners free now. Because a thriving community does not have jails.
Right.
Like, woo, that's a mind bender. That's a mind bender, but that's what it says in the Bible. So
set the captives free. Jesus quoted that.
Folks with different abilities, folks who are disabled, you know, they have access into community and into leadership, and, you know, in exactly as they are, you know, all of these things that white supremacy doesn't want for us, actually. It wants us to produce and consume. And if we can't do that, then we are worthless to this system.
Right.
And I don't want to live in a world like that. And God doesn't want us to live in a world like that.
And it just feels like such seed planting kind of work. And I'm sure, and we talked about this the last time we talked, but you know, that the reason why we spoke in the first place was because your team was following up on, everybody had downloaded the racial justice toolkit, and and I'm sure most of those were white folks in white churches, and your person that was calling got to me and was like, "Huh, you're a little different," but you're not in the usual situation. But so because SURJ has been operating in this and planting seeds, have you seen those seeds really start to grow? Have you seen, do you know of churches that have really pressed into this work, or is it still at we're waiting for the seeds to produce kind of?
Yeah, I think it's a both and. We know of, and we're still calling through that list, so maybe you want to help us. You know, we've been working on this campaign since 2017, and when we first started, it was like pulling teeth to get congregations to even have a conversation with us, much less actually participate in the campaign. And at that time, we were doing, like, we invited churches in, and we did this cohort, and we would, you know, have this like intense 6-month or 4-month, I forget exactly, training sessions, and at the end they had to, you know, to make some kind of declaration, and it was just nearly impossible. Like, we would contact progressive churches that had been with us, had participated in SURJ faith stuff with us before, had Black Lives Matter banners hung on their buildings, and they would be like, no, we can't, we like our relationship with the police, we can't talk about, we're not going to do that. Or, you know, we were accused of being divisive, you know, Jesus would never ask us to choose sides like this. Like, okay, you know, all kinds of stuff. And so, but we kept going. And then in 2020, I had in my work plan was that we're not going to do the cohort thing anymore, but I'm going to turn this into something that congregations can use, because I feel I'm passionate about it, and I feel it's actually really necessary work that congregations need to do, especially Christian congregations, because of the ways that white Christian theology like is the moral backbone of white supremacy and of the system of policing. It is necessary. It is a necessary piece of the work for congregations as congregations to divest themselves from harmful systems such as this. So in 2020, I was like, I'm gonna do something, turn it into a toolkit or something, so that congregations can still do this. And then of course the uprisings happened, and then the movement for Black Lives is like, we have to defund the police, and then that just became, that illuminated, right? Yeah. That we actually have to make a choice about what kind of world that we want. And the brilliance of insisting on that language, yeah, it provokes something, but it's intended to. And what it has provoked is the possibility for more white people to say yes. That's part of what it's provoked. For more white people to say, yeah, I actually want to invest in a different kind of world.
Yeah.
Where, the police aren't killing people with impunity. Like, I want to invest in a different kind of world where my brother, who has this is a hypothetical, my sibling, whoever has a mental health problem, ends up in jail, dies with no help, or is traumatized by that experience, doesn't get the support they need, whatever. And so, I always want to remind white folks that, like, yeah, it's provocative language. It's illuminating the choice that we have to make as white people of what kind of world we want to invest in, what kind of world we want to live in. And it was genius, because what happened after that outcry came was we launched that toolkit, and we had nearly 1,500 people access it. Wow. in the year. Time in the pandemic is such a wacky thing. No, I'm like, 2020, 2021, year and a little bit.
Yeah. Since
we launched it. We know of, in a conversation with 25 congregations that have engaged it, are engaging it in some way or another. Like this urban congregation I mentioned before, used some of the tools in the toolkit to figure out their new security practice and plan.
Yeah.
And so, and there are probably more that we just don't know about, because we haven't been able to call through that whole list yet. If anybody wants to help, please reach out.
Right.
Because it's just me in a part-time role and some volunteers. Or there are folks like you who have reached out with questions and are really wrestling with it. There's another like 50 folks there who, with support and encouragement, could make that next move into action.
Yeah. Right.
And we did not have that before the uprising. We did not have that before that defund police outcry for abolition became so mainstream. And, I think, as white folks, we get all creaky about defund. It's so divisive. It's so inflammatory, but it has made so much more possible.
Right.
And so we're seeing some sense of harvest of seeds that SURJ Faith has been planting for a long time, and also that the movement for Black Lives has been planting for a long time, because I don't want to only take credit for that.
Right.
And also we know that we're still planting seeds, right? We're still planting seeds that we may not even ever see the harvest of.
Right.
But at some point, who knows, somebody may be using that toolkit somewhere. We'll never actually know about it, but they'll have, done some of that work with their congregation.
Yeah. To
figure out, we're going to have a mental health first aid response team instead of calling 911. Like that's a thing a congregation can do.
Now the wheels are like there should be smoke coming out of my ears, but it was like that the last time we spoke. So I should just continue to think that every time I talk to Reverend Ann, this is what's going to happen. So how you mentioned this, and I want to highlight something in your bio. So you're an herbalist.
Yes.
Is that one of the ways that, you know, you talk about the the care and the rigor? So how do you stay resilient in this, and not just endure, not just keep pushing, not just keep operating under that white supremacist machine? So how do you find that balance?
Yeah, that's such a great question. Especially in this time of like the pandemic, climate crisis, uh, racial capitalism falling down around our ears. You know, it like people are under immense amounts of strain, and so this question of resilience, and resilience is really about our ability to stay adaptable in the midst of change, in the midst of, and even good change. We are in the midst of what I hope will eventually be good change, but right now is really scary change, you know. And you know, and so the herbal practice is key to me for that. I mean, it's key to me for a lot of reasons, but it's actually one of the ways in which I first began to identify my own mutual interest in getting liberated from white supremacy, was because I was totally burned out by trying to be the perfect activist. Again, that kind of perfectionism, the urgency, the showing up for everything, having to do it right all the time, can't make a mistake, have to be at all. Like, I had a crisis.
Yeah.
And, you know, I went to the doctor, I went to a therapist, but a friend of mine said, why don't you go see our herbalist friends for an actual consult? And so I did, and working with the herbs and beginning to like look at how the rhythms and the seasons of the earth, like, they need rest. That's part of what happens. There's waxing, there's a waning, you know, there, especially up here in Buffalo, there's the fallow time where everything's under the snow. It's not doing anything other than just resting under there, building up energy for spring to come. Like, you know, reflecting on those patterns, those cycles of Sabbath that we find in the Bible, and God calling that good. And like, that's not what capitalism asks of us. And I'm not gonna survive if I keep trying to live like that.
Yeah.
And so so I've been doing herbal practice since 2011, and got trained by my teacher to be a community herbalist. And so, you know, the ways in which the earth actually wants to help us, you know, to find our way back to them.
Yeah.
Find our way back to the plants, find our way back to those rhythms, and that we as white folks actually have these traditions in our lineages. We don't have to take them from other cultures. We actually have them in Irish tradition, British, Scottish, French, like Western Europe. Like, we have these practices and ways of relating to the land that help us remember to rest, that help keep our hearts soft and open, that help us know how to tend to our bodies and our hearts when they're aching and broken, that help us remember how to be in community, not only with other humans, but also the rest of creation too.
Yeah.
Remembering our place, not outside of nature, but as part of it, that we're meant to rest.
Yeah.
We're meant to fruit. We're meant, in, I don't just mean with children, but to generate life in all kinds of ways.
Right.
You know, we're meant to allow for fallow times. And so, you know, over time, I've tried to, you know, it can be challenging because we still live in the system of racial capitalism and you know, the world falling apart, but make sure that there are those kinds of times in my day, in the seasons. You know, the pandemic has really taught me that I have to slow way down.
Yeah.
And that there is so much out there that around us that wants to help us as humans find our way back to who we're meant to be and how we're meant to be.
I've appreciated and enjoyed this so much. This has just been really delightful. So thank you. When I say us, I mean the us who are listening, whenever they're listening. But if individuals and churches, congregations want to know more, where can they go?
They can go to the SURJ website, SURJ.org, surj.org. The faith work is under the, I forget what tab it is on the menu, but you'll find it. It'll be there. And you can learn more about us there. You can learn about the campaign. You can learn about some of the other resources that we have, our podcast, other stuff there as well. And there are ways to reach out to us for conversation, support, whatever, we're here and we love you. And that's why we do the work that we do.
Yeah, well, thank you. I really appreciate this. This is this whole season of this podcast is, this idea of applying Jesus, a little turning the idea, the typical evangelical idea, on its head, because it's so we can. I feel like this is a call back, not just to a new vision of the future, but to bring forward what has always been true about our faith tradition, and including our ancient history, that we bring that forward into the present and into the vision of the future, that we can apply Jesus and his model for living, and in his short life, that the revolutionary things that he said and did. That's what's exciting, is that it's like you said, what kind of world? This is the essence for me. What kind of world do we want to build? And Scripture teaches us that. And so we can apply that at an individual, like a self level, and a family unit level, and just build from there. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me into this conversation with you. I really appreciate it.
Well, I can't wait till we nerd out later. I will plan that season. It's just like nerding out. that's the title. Nerding out. Awesome. Well, Reverend Ann, it's been a joy to be with you, and be blessed. Can I speak a word of blessing over you, or would you like to speak one over us?
You know what? I would love it if you would speak a word of blessing over me. It's actually been a really hard week, so okay. I would love to receive that. So thank you. Okay.
I'll use my favorite one from number 6. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. And may God remind you that he lifts up his countenance upon you, and it is peace that he gives. So I just pray that you receive that in Jesus' name. Amen. Applying Jesus is hosted and produced by Amy Vogel, Director of Spiritual Growth for Upper Room Heights. We record at Chapelwood United Methodist Church Digital Studio in Houston, Texas. We hope something you heard today has deepened your faith, opened your eyes, and led you to not only knowing God in a more expansive way, but shift how you connect, especially with those who are easy to overlook. To find out more about Amy and our church community, go to www.urheights.com. Find us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. Remember, we love you, and there's nothing you can do about it.